Hi everyone, and welcome to SpeakuP Monday. Today I am your host, Bhavna Parihar, and we're coming to you live from beautiful Bali at Tropical Nomad Canggu in Indonesia. SpeakuP Monday, for those joining for the first time, is a platform dedicated to inspiration. We believe that people inspire people, and that the more conversations we have, the more perspective we gain, and the more compassionate we become. We believe there's unity in our collective diversity, and for that reason, 3 years running, we've had a variety of speakers here every single Monday to share their story in the hope to inspire, educate, and create more love and humanity in the world. Today, I'm honored to have Melanie Lynch as my guest. She is the founder and CEO of Herstory, a movement dedicated to sharing the stories of women internationally through arts, education, light shows, to name a few. She comes from a very background of high-powered advertising in London and Paris, which set her down a path to where she is now. Definitely not a linear journey, but a very important one. And so we can't wait to dive into what it means to be a compassionate feminist, how we can turn the battle of the sexes, the war of the sexes, into a delicate dance to equality, and the work that she does today that we can take and embody in our day-to-day lives. So please join me in welcoming Melanie Lynch. So to kick us off, I think to set the stage of your background, where you were, take us to a point in time, I'm thinking probably London or Paris or anywhere else, that you started to sort of feel that a change was afoot for you. What did that feel like? What did that look like?
Oh, I'll never forget it. So it was 3 o'clock in the morning and I was in our office in Paris working for the #1 most award-winning agency in France. Like, I was living the dream. I'd worked so hard to get there, top of the game in the advertising industry. And I went on Facebook. I was working on a pitch. Typical creative, off on a tangent, go on Facebook, and I witness one of my best friends at her office in Kenya. She's a safari guide, and she had an elephant in her office, and I was a bit jealous. I thought, God, Mel, you need to find some work-life balance, like, get a life. So I suppose a series of events happened from that moment, and I went through a knee-jerk awakening of sorts. I traveled to Kenya to connect with my university friends, and we went on safari together. I lived that dream, and I stayed on in Kenya from there up on the Great Rift Valley in the original spiritual home of the Maasai tribe up in the highlands. It's an incredibly beautiful place. And I had a lot of epiphanies about my life, my direction. I'm a socialist by nature, so I shouldn't be in the advertising industry. It doesn't make any sense. It was really starting to grate with my nervous system and with my soul, to be honest. But I had, I suppose, a lucky moment at the beginning of my career. My first advertising campaign was for Bernardo's, a children's charity in the UK. We raised an extra £2 million for the charity in the middle of a recession. And volunteering applications went up by 50%. So I saw the power of communications if you use it for good. But unfortunately, I was spending a lot of time answering briefs, selling people stuff they just don't need, you know? I mean, look where consumerism and capitalism has led us today, you know? The environment is on its knees and we're all spinning out. I mean, I honestly think the selfie pandemic is far worse than COVID, you know? Narcissism is just gone bananas. So yeah, it was a big wake-up call, and that Kenya was the turning point for me, so. Yeah.
Can you describe maybe when you're saying that those moments of like sort of the narcissistic moments, or when you start to kind of feel that inequality, even in the workplace? You know, you may not have listened to it because it just seemed natural. I mean, many of us subscribe to that, where it felt there was a bit of inequality, or that sort of, you know, battle of the male versus female, the patriarchy. Were there any moments like that happened that at the time you just allowed for it to be the way it was because that's the conditioning and the environment you were in, but that was a clue for what set you down a path that you did?
Sure, yeah. So I suppose if you first track back to my childhood, feminism wasn't on my radar at all. Women in my family were equal to men, going back generations. So my great-grandfather was a feminist, outspoken feminist. My grandmother was the second woman in her hometown to keep her career when she got married. It actually was against the law in Ireland. If you're a civil servant, you weren't allowed to continue your career when you got married. Mind-boggling. But she wasn't. There was no question about it. She was a pharmacist and loved her career, very independent. And my mother, you know, there was no question about us all being educated to whatever extent we want to live our dreams. So it was a bit of an anomaly that I actually started Herstory, and it wasn't really inspired by my experiences in the ad industry, but there were some moments, like the sexism it's not subtle. There's a lot of subtleties to sexism, misogyny, and yeah. You've worked in the industry.
I come from the advertising background, so I know that world way too well.
Yeah.
But I think just for the benefit of those who aren't, I mean, there's so many subtle moments like that we kind of allow for. Yeah. At what point? So you said you went to Kenya, and that was like a turning point for you. Were you still working in the same industry at that time?
So I was still freelancing, but I returned home to Ireland, and I had to go through quite an ego death to let go of this attachment to the ad industry, and I'd built up this whole career. And I put the graft in. I'd only worked for the best agencies. It's a tough game. It's, you know yourself. And so it was like a shattering of my ego, and it was a process, and it was very uncomfortable at times. And I did have insomnia, and I had moments of anxiety and panic attacks because in a sense, it was like my soul was waking up to its truth. And it was like, get me the hell out of here. But you get attached to having a nice salary and nice things in your life and living the dream in London and Paris. But it isn't at a deep level, it wasn't my dream. And I had to listen to that. I was forced to. I had no choice. And so one of the big triggers actually was for Herstory. Specifically, with this legendary, I say legendary, most people have never heard her name in my hometown, but she should be legendary. She is in her, and was in her field. Josephine Hart famously had a beautiful heart, was the wife of Mara Saatchi, founder of Saatchi and Saatchi, the advertising agency from my hometown of Mullingar. Is only really known often, the papers will say she is the wife of this very famous advertising kingpin. She was actually his boss before he co-founded Saatchi and Saatchi, but they'll never write that in the papers. She was the first female director of Haymarket Publishing and a best-selling novelist. Her books were turned into movies, poetry evangelist, award-winning theatre producer, all-round heart of gold. No notions at all. I met with Morris. He said, he would say to her, "Oh, you're Lady Saatchi," because that was her title. And she was like, "Oh no, I'm Josephine Hart from Mullingar, and that's plenty good for me, Just a really beautiful person. Went into the local school where Josephine had gone to school. The kids had never heard her name before. They could tell me what Kim Kardashian had for breakfast. I, honestly, angry feminist overnight. I was incensed. And then it was so bizarre. At the same time, the powers that be in our local government were having very serious conversations about building a museum to Niall Horan, who is from One Direction, famous Irish. We've got lots of cool people from my little hometown in Mullingar, in the middle of nowhere in rural Ireland. And they were going to build a museum to this 21-year-old pop star. And he said, "Look, that's absurd. Who builds a museum to a 21-year-old?"
And he said that. So he questioned
it. He was
That's
like,
amazing.
"This is ridiculous." Yeah. Oh, he's a really nice guy. He's very down to earth. We do genuinely all love him. At the same time, Josephine Hart's family home was bulldozed down and turned into a car park. There's no formal recognition of her in our town. And that was just a big trigger. And then I was introduced to a book called Wild Irish Women, and I recognised 5 of the 75 names. So in our curriculum in school, typically there'd be 5 women on the curriculum. All the subjects. It's like women didn't do anything. It actually still says in the Irish Constitution that an Irish woman's place is in the home.
And you're working to change that.
Oh, well, yeah, that's coming. But beyond that, we want to rewrite the whole curriculum so it has equal gender representation across all school subjects.
So when you had that moment, because then you didn't start Herstory right away. It was born from, imagine, a lot of just moments, discoveries, examples through travels, even through your time with your family. Can you pinpoint a couple of those moments that sort of created those guideposts that led you down this path?
I remember sitting down and said, well, Herstory, it was a few months old, actually. So from that moment, it sparked, and I was starting to toy around with the idea of just creating an exhibition one-off and then doing something completely different. It was never going to be the scale it is today. I no inclination at all about that. And I remember meeting with the Royal Irish Academy, who they curate this resource called the Dictionary of Irish Biography, a very formal, official academic resource. And it's their job to document notable people in Irish culture. And most countries, by the way, have this resource if you go digging for it. And they said, sheepishly, look, we've got something to tell you. Because you started Herstory, we thought we might just count the number of women already featured in the Dictionary of Irish Biography. There's over 1,000 women there. just sitting there, all these amazing stories gathering dust when there's 5 women on the school curriculum. I thought, oh dear, we have to get the Department of Education, the Department of Culture talking to each other. There's, because the stories are there. We just need to make them accessible and relatable. But unfortunately, it takes a very long time to change a school curriculum. Could take, honestly, it won't be my children, it'll be my great-grandchildren. Maybe my grandchildren who will experience a gender equal curriculum. And that's across all spectrums of gender. So we didn't wait around. We decided, okay, we've got to do something really spectacular. So I reached out to the national broadcaster. We made a huge TV series, animation series, podcasts. And I have a real strong sense of making the invisible visible, because the women have literally been invisible, in the shadows, in the darkness. So I was meditating one day, a rainy, miserable Sunday afternoon. And when you're not supposed to be having epiphany, sure, that's when you have the best ideas. Well, if Ireland lights up the world green on St. Patrick's Day, which we still really can't get our head around, by the way, it's kind of bizarre but beautiful, what would happen if we lit up in honour of women? And so the first year we started the Herstory Light Festival, and it went viral all around Ireland, and castles, museums and libraries and offices all illuminated in honour of women. And that's an annual event now. And it's not subtle, and they're not going to be lost. They're not going back into the shadows of the darkness. But it's quite sweet, actually, because I was talking to my little sisters. I've got 2 little sisters, 7-year-old and 9-year-old, Lily and Saoirse. And I asked them, like, what's their favourite part of her story? Is it the animations or the really cool art that we commission, They said, no, it's the light show. It's the magic of seeing the women honoured on huge, iconic buildings. It's so moving. Like a 9-year-old really resonating with that.
So I actually want to touch on that word light that you just used. In some of the conversations in your bio, you talk about, the journey to be doing this work, to become that compassionate feminist. I mean, there is the adverse of that, right? There is the angry feminist. So from taking some of those emotions that maybe were suppressed, that are being projected based on, reading stories where you feel women aren't being featured, or you're encountering in your workplace, you're seeing the misogyny, and you're absorbing all of those emotions, and then you start to see it project out in different ways. What did you do with that shadow, that anger, that could have been used for destructive means? You could have just been that angry woman just spewing out stuff using your platform. What did you do to shift that shadow into light and transmute that into something positive?
Yeah, that was like a real aha moment for me. And I have to be honest, like, I really held a mirror to myself. I became an angry feminist overnight, and I didn't know what to do with this anger. But I knew from my communications background, like, you have to find a healthy expression, or if you're going to commute, through anger, it has to be for a reason. And so I really sat deeply with that anger, and I held up a mirror. I had a good look at myself, and I tracked my behavior, and I noticed I was projecting this anger onto men in my life. Men, by the way, who've been feminists long before I was. Like, my little brother's 6 years younger than me, and he was the first feminist in our family of my siblings. My uncle, my dad, like, these men who are just amazing supporters of women. How could I thought, it's quite absurd when you think about it. So this is thousands of years of suppressed wrath of the patriarchy, which is absolutely justified and understandable, but it's quite ridiculous to project it onto these men who haven't been causing the situation. And the reality is, very few contemporary men have a real definitive role in the patriarchy that we experience today. It's an evolution of, yeah? So I had to do something with this anger. And I love the analogy that Eckhart Tolle gives. He says, if you think of anger as a big fiery ball of energy in your hand, it's amazing, so fiery, so potent, you could do anything with it. He says, now drop the anger, keep the energy, and play. Haha. Turning point. That was really, really helped me. And also the work of, there's another brilliant psychiatrist that I love. He talks about how anger is the tipping point emotion. It's the last so-called negative emotion of the scale of emotions. So you have a choice. You can choose it to deconstruct or construct. And that is ultimately your power within. You can't go, that person made me angry, therefore I can blow my hat. No. We have to own our shadow, and that's okay, hey? Now, I'm lucky I play with a ginormous big projector. I get to light up these huge buildings, and that's my alchemical process. That's my transmuting the anger into light and love. And ultimately, her story it's very uplifting and positive and compassionate. And that was quite a process, and it still is. And there's days that I still get angry, and that's okay. That's part of the process too. But as much as I can, I try to alchemize that anger, as much for the collective of having responsibility of what I'm putting out into the world, but also for my own physical health. Like, it's very bad for your organs, for your liver, for your heart, to hold on to too much anger. They know that, like, it's proven scientifically.
So as part of, because I feel like that also part of your journey of alchemizing that and evolving that into work of good has probably come from, you've been traveling, you've been doing research projects, you've been diving into the stories of tribes and women to see, are there examples in society, maybe thousands of years back, that they do live in harmony that way, they do live in harmony with each other, or are there matrilineal societies that we can take our cues from? Because they exist, and whether those stories are being captured or not is part of the work that I know you want to do and others do. What can you kind of touch on, maybe a trip or a visit where you saw, in this day and age, at this moment, it's one thing for it to have been years ago, that we see them operating in that dance and not so much that battle?
Yeah, a great example would be the Menincabaugh Tribe in West Sumatra. They're the largest matrilineal tribe in the world. There's 8 million people. I was supposed to be there this week, actually. I'm not supposed to be here, but they had an earthquake, unfortunately, so I postponed the trip. But yesterday, for Mother's Day, we interviewed Saraz Sapayo, who might be here. We're going to be catching up with her later. She's an amazing young Minang woman. She's 31 years old. She's a successful entrepreneur, and she comes from this culture that it's quite a paradox in that it's the opposite of the patriarchy. So inheritance is passed from mother to daughter. She says that Minang women run the world like Beyonce, and they kind of do. But there's a very specific role as well for the men, and the men don't feel disempowered either. It's more of a partnership dance than a domination dance. There's a difference between matrilineal and matriarchal, and it's subtle at times too. And this culture is like it's very ancient. Originally animist, so they are nature-loving people. They believe in the wisdom of nature, that nature is our greatest teacher, as a balancer, as a harmonizing force. And they specifically focus on the nurturing aspect of nature. That's a very conscious process. So you could choose to focus on the threatening aspect of nature, the predator versus prey, but they choose the nurturing aspect, and they embody that within their culture at an individual level and a collective level. So I just think, as a reference point for the Western world, because we've really lost that connection to the land, to nature, protecting the environment, and to Mother Earth, the goddess culture, the sacred feminine, the Minang can teach us a lot. Fascinating though, today, they've also adopted Islam, but they're very progressive Muslims. So they're matrilineal and Muslim. And she talks yesterday, and I can share this afterwards with you all, it's beautiful interview, and she talked about the Prophet Muhammad's wife Khadija and how she was such a beautiful role model for Muslim women, a very successful businesswoman, 15 years older than the Prophet, and I actually hired him when he was a young lad, and then they got married, they fell in love, and he was monogamous to Khadija until she passed away, which would have been quite unusual at the time. Normally, it was acceptable to have multiple wives in their culture. And so it's a very beautiful relationship. And she talks so passionately about that and the role of women in Islam too. And that's a story we very rarely hear, especially in Western culture. Islam is so badly misrepresented. So to hear of Sarah as like a young woman who is so comfortable with paradox and contradiction, and I think what I find fascinating about that conversation in particular is when you take the feminine approach to integration, there was no need for wars or conflict or discrimination or racism. They didn't lose the strength of their original culture. They took the wisdom of the Minang, animist, nature-loving culture, and then they married that with the most progressive aspects of Islam, and they've emerged all the stronger. Whereas in the West, you often see that where there's integration, there's wars, there's racism, discrimination, there's all sorts of acts of violence.
So in a society like that, that unfortunately or fortunately soon is going to be preserved and shared, because we don't hear these stories, which is part of the work that you do. How did they balance though that power, that dominance? Because I mean there is a level of living in harmony, but in order to get things done, there needs to be duty, obligation, responsibility. So in these societies, what are they doing to create that balance of power, or the different expressions of power that you've mentioned before?
Yeah, so they don't use a domination model of power really within their culture. So the women, they're at the center, the heart of the community. And then the men have a role, and they're expected to go on the hero's journey. So they travel, they go abroad, they start businesses, and then they return home to the women. And the women then run the community, but it's in a very progressive way. And so there's sometimes a very subtle difference with domination and the other types of power, and there are 4 expressions of power that I'd love to share with you all, because a lot of people, it's amazing how people aren't aware of this, but the domination model of power, the power over system, is one of the 4 expressions of power. All the other 3 lead to equality. So if you look throughout human history, the domination system has only really been prevalent for the last, say, 5,000 to 10,000 years, depending on where you are in the world. There's no evidence that humanity was originally a war-faring people, a species. There's no evidence of war beyond 10,000 years ago. We're not inherently violent. All the evidence is there in archaeology, in the original art. I would really recommend the work of Rian Eisler, pioneering social system scientist, cultural historian, academic. Her findings for me are just wow, because it gives you a sense of hope into the future, that if we're not inherently warriors, what could we be? And when you look actually and track the evidence of humanity before the patriarchal era, before domination, you see that partnership systems were much more prevalent. So it's what we could potentially return to in the future. And it's just a lot of it's conditioning. And I get very excited then. We have a brilliant educational psychologist in our project called Dr. Emma Black. And I sat down with Emma and I said, so there's 4 expressions of power. Like, how can we teach young people? How young can we teach them, Mm-hmm. And she said 8 years old, an 8-year-old child will get this. And if they can start to track and observe how power has been used in their community, in their family, in society, you could literally rewrite the whole future. It's game changing. So there's the power over the domination model, which fundamentally always leads to inequality. Somebody has power over somebody else. And it blocks the energy, blocks the flow. It kills creativity, it kills joy. It stops interaction, stops community. The next one is power 2. I give you power. I empower you. Then there's power with. We share power together, and that's synarchic. So typically women love this model. It's the synarchic flow, and it creates, in physics, it literally creates an upward spiral of energy. The energy flows. And so the 4th power expression is the power within. Do you choose the domination system, power over, or do you choose the systems that lead to equality, power with, power to? And you ultimately have a choice. And I would just catch yourself in the next few days, just watch and observe. And if you do track yourself wanting to dominate, don't judge it either. I think judgment is such a sticky, silly, emotion. It leads to so much rigidity, and I don't know, guilt and shame and all that silliness. We just got to drop the judgment and just discern, track yourself from the perspective of the witness, observe yourself. Okay, what happens now if I slip into a state of equality? If I use power to, power with? And so we still need, in this world, we still need some hierarchies. We still need teachers, we need lawyers, we need politicians, we need leaders. But do they choose a hierarchy of domination or a hierarchy of actualization? These are the teachings of Rian Eisler. She's just so profound. And for me, that's a game changer. And that's when you can shift from domination to partnership. And the men have to be invited in that process. Often with feminism, it's women championing women. From my experience, with Herstory, the movement that I run, we have as many Herstory godfathers as godmothers, but in a lot of feminist space, you won't see that. And so it's very important that we get to a stage where we invite the men into that space too,
And so I think that's interesting what you say, because it's about if there is one champion, even a male champion, because knowing to shift that needle, to go from, even though, as we said, thousands of years ago, this dynamic, it didn't work, it didn't exist that way, and now 10,000 years later, this is how we're operating. But within every subsect, every community, every culture, there is possibly one male champion who, as you said, is championing those stories and wanting to preserve that. Because, it's not lost on me that we now talk about empowerment, women's empowerment, as this like buzzword that's trendy, and, talks are dedicated to that, but that is literally one expression of power that we are now sort of waking ourselves up to, or the idea that we listen to ourselves and we witness and watch that ball of energy move around and get back to here. So it's interesting to me that we're kind of going through this evolution or this era right now of getting back to those earlier expressions of power in the way that we operate day to day. In doing so, though, how can the men in these environments support that to help kind of rewrite, or I shouldn't say rewrite, but actually document what's already being written in the story?
Yeah, so what you want to do is be very careful about not repeating what history has done. So you don't want men, in the past men have championed men and the women were left out of the equation. What you don't want then is women only championing women. You actually can't get to equality unless everybody's participating. And so with Herstory, we tell women's stories, but the men are part of that process. So if, we work with male artists and historians, and a lot of men have been absolutely key to opening doors, to fundraising. We actually had a very big production blocked by a woman. We all assumed it was the man at the very top of the institution. He came up to me off the record and said, look, actually it wasn't me. But if you get her to green light it, I'll sign off on it. So we all made this assumption that it was the man. Actually, it was a woman tripping up other women. Honestly, I've experienced more toxic femininity than toxic masculinity with Herstory. And that's okay. It's part of the shadow. The shadow comes up. It gets triggered. Especially when you're doing big light shows. It's not subtle. People get triggered. And so it's the compassionate space of, okay, how do we move beyond this? And it's creating opportunities for men to be a part of that process. Like, for example, we have an amazing Minister for Foreign Affairs in Ireland, Simon Coveney, who spoke to the United Nations. He gave an address and talked about the role of women in the peace process in Northern Ireland. They're absolutely legendary. The role of the women it's a key United Nations case study. Would you believe it's still not being taught in the curriculums in the Republic of Ireland or in Northern Ireland? And that's my next project now, is to change that. But he said, he finished this really iconic speech in front of the whole United Nations. He said, history needs her story. It is not only the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, which I thought was really wow. And he's got 3 young daughters, and he's one of the greatest feminists in Ireland, So it's creating opportunities, and then the men they'll take the baton. But like, what you got to watch out for as well is it becoming really, it cannot be just a women's project for women.
Because then do you think that it's quite possible that when we talk about sort of the battle of the sexes or the war of the sexes, and eventually getting to the dance to equality, it is not so much just about, because there is that sense of women banding together and, women's tribe and all, and there's a beautiful place for that. But there is also a sense of that potential war is actually self-gender inflicted, because if it starts to become a male versus female, because we feel that we need to be empowered and rise above, that we're just creating more aggression, and we're not allowing ourselves to do that delicate dance. So how does one, in their day-to-day, manage that delicate dance? How would you describe it in a workplace environment to do that delicate dance?
Sometimes I have to protect the men in the room. And that's part of the job. It's just tracking myself, though. And it's okay to be angry, too, and to own that anger, but it's what I do with it. And sometimes, actually, it's really important to express the anger, because it gives people permission to actually feel angry about something, especially if it's a human rights issue. One example, I suppose, would be we did a campaign for the mother and baby homes in Ireland. So they're institutions that were run by the Catholic Church, where they severely abused women, incarcerated them against their will, like the Magdalene laundries. Very terribly dark part of our history. I could have actually been in one of those homes, because my mum broke the rules and had me out of wedlock when she was 20 years of age. So I was actually breaking the rules the minute I was conceived. And it's mad to think that, like, in Ireland, when I was born, by law, because I was illegitimate, I couldn't have been a civil servant, I couldn't have been a teacher or a doctor, and I couldn't have owned land, which is a big thing in Ireland because of our past with colonialism. It's a big thing about our culture, is to feel safe in the land. And so we've gone through this huge evolution. I'm 35 now, and it's amazing to see, obviously, the law changed then a year or two after I was born, thank God. But how we helped to heal that process and to work with the activists involved in the campaign. and the survivors and the victims, and to really feel that rage and then to transmute that into something that, to commission art that was very angry and visceral and sad. And then we created a series of portraits reclaiming the mother archetype, taking her back from the church. And we lit them up on really iconic buildings. And I honestly thought that was the end of our funding. I thought, that's it, we're done. The breastfeeding Madonna, like defiant, with a baby girl, not baby Jesus, baby girl. They were, and really brave. And it was that there was the headline story in positive news story on our national broadcaster on Bridget's Day. And so you'd be surprised sometimes Ireland and other cultures, they can be ahead of the game. You might place them, being behind where you think they are, but we are making leaps. We're lucky, there's been a lot of, I suppose, really fast change. But I'd love to share this one particular key moment in that whole process of getting to where I am today, where I had an epiphany. So I'm trained in communications, and I was analysing all of these women's stories. It's very early days of Herstory. I was analysing, looking for behavioural trends, trying to track what was going on in these stories. And in every single iconic woman's story, you can see the systems and structures that were in place to suppress her. They're all there. Like, no woman, no matter how influential she was, whether she was Anglo-Irish aristocracy, whether she had access to great education, they all had to smash the ceiling. And quite a few ceilings, actually, depending on their circumstances. But then I noticed something really remarkable. I noticed that in nearly every single woman's story, there was at least one man who saw her as an equal and championed her talents. And this is going back all the way through history. I'm getting shivers saying it. They were fathers, they were brothers, they were husbands, sons, amazing mother-son dynamics, father-daughter dynamics, friends. And I sat down with Senya Paseta, who is the professor of modern history at Oxford University, one of our mentors. And I said, Senya, I'm after noticing this trend. Have you ever seen this before? Did you ever track it? She's like, no, but that is so powerful. She said, that's your next big future project. Okay. And that's partnership systems. And by telling those stories, we are literally dissolving the domination systems at place within our own psyches, within the collective field. It's showing a new way forward. And it's also, when you walk into the National Gallery, it's a very one-dimensional story. We become obsessed with individualism, but within that frame, we're not capturing the full story. It's so controlled, this one individual, and you don't see the people who help that individual get to the place where they are. And often it's these unique dynamics and partnerships that make it happen. And some of my favorite stories actually are the lesbian partnerships from the 1916 Rising, when Ireland fought for independence. They're the most incredible badass women whose stories only re-emerged because of the centenary. They were swept under the carpet at the 50th anniversary. 100 years later, though, whoa, we were ready for it. And it was amazing. Centerfold. Yeah.
What do you think then is that turning point where these stories, as we said, it's very much been his story, and now you're working to incorporate her story and actually make it not rewrite history, but actually just make it representation of her and his. Why do you think, in your belief system, that it was suppressed the way that it has, or not showcased? And what do you think is happening now that is allowing people to accept it, that these champions are coming to the forefront? What do you think the shift has been?
I think, if you look at any polarity, when it's stretched to breaking point, and it really is, like the victim-tyrant polarity is the definitive polarity of the patriarchal era. When it's stretched, it either snaps or it shifts back to center, it can only go so far. And then our humanity emerges, and our yearning for just a sense of connection and harmony. It's inherent in when you look at a baby, they're just a bundle of love and harmony, and babies don't know how to feel shame and guilt. They're actually not primal emotions, and they're emotions primarily constructed in the patriarchal era. And so you've got to remember that. You're going back to the core of what it means to be human. Why was it the case? Do we have to learn our lessons? Do they have to be so hard to learn? Why do we still idolize ancient Greek culture? It's super regressive. It's like a dogmatic patriarchal culture. It's funny, just track what you idolize. and what you think is progressive and how it's portrayed and how it's constructed. And we both worked in advertising. Like, we worked in the business of creating ideologies and propaganda. And so the gift of that is, like, I'm not tracking going, okay, where do we need to dissolve this one or that one, you know? And it's complex. Like, history is very complex. I think deep down, there is, and I've talked to men about this, there is a fear of feminine power too, because of our intuition, our emotional skills. And I think you have to also have compassion for men in that we've now reached this era where it's not culturally acceptable for a man to express negative emotions like shame or guilt or fear in public, or even within family structures, only alone or with a counsellor. That's bananas. Like, it's barking mad. And so, you know, it's really complex. But I would honestly say, and I know a lot of academics would also mirror this philosophy, women and men have suffered equally throughout the patriarchal era. Like, I cannot imagine as a woman being trained to kill somebody else, being forced to conscript. And that operates, that's in the male psyche, that they're expected to do that. And then they're not allowed to process these emotions, and they're deemed as weak. And my brother is actually the most sensitive. He's got 4 sisters, and he's the most sensitive and sweet of all of us. And he's just qualified as a doctor, and he'll make an even better doctor because of that. But it's that space, you know, I think, where we come together. We do our work maybe apart. Sometimes we have to do our work apart as well. And then we come together and we go, oh, Jesus, that was a mess. What the hell happened the last 5,000 years, you know? And how we move beyond that. There's a lot that needs to be deconstructed. It's naturally happening. And then you see the shadow rise and those tyrants, you know, I suppose personified by the likes of Trump and Putin. And they're just a shadow. They're holding up that mirror to all of us. And we're seeing, you know, the aspects of that within our culture and our own, you know, immediate spheres and stuff. And that's all part of the dance, and it's uncomfortable and it's triggering. But you know, in some ways, I do have great hope for humanity too. Like, when you see the young people today, like, they've never, ever risen up on this scale ever before in history. Young people, thanks to Greta Thunberg. Never, ever. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. They're so politically, socially, culturally, environmentally aware. And they're powerful, and they influence EU policy, global policy on environmentalism. They're really powerful. And when I talk to them and they feel disenfranchised, I said, you are the most powerful young generation that ever walked the planet. And what you see as well, what's really exciting about activism is when you track the historical records, you have a catalyst moment, the first cause that an activist will rise to. In the case, say, for example, in the 1916 Rising, the women were involved in the fight for independence in Ireland. That was the beginning of their activism. They were activists for life then, and they took up the cause of trade unionism or women's rights, girls' education. So it was the beginning of a process. So you've got this whole generation worldwide, globally, that are now like natural, like activism is core to who they are. And that gets me excited, you know, when you see what Putin's up to, and it's absolutely heartbreaking what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment. And then you see these young people saying, nah, we've had enough.
So actually, on that note, speaking of young people, we actually met through Desi, who was a DIAC activist, and she was actually on this stage not too long ago. And, you know, in meeting her, she is, quote unquote, a young person, 25 years old, in Borneo. And I know you had a trip with her, and I would love for you to share some of those key moments in terms of how her and the other youth interact, how you saw that male and female dance, and how this is how they're existing now, and how that's making its way into her story. Because it's not just, as you said, about women's stories in Ireland, it's a global international movement. So yeah, maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually wearing this beautiful necklace that Desi gifted me. It's a present. So it's a ceremonial necklace from the Dayak culture. They are the guardians of the Borneo rainforest and have been for millennia, and they only know sustainability and organic. That's their normal. It's extraordinary culture. Typically, you'll find where indigenous cultures respect nature, women are also equally respected. And so men and women in their culture are equal. They elect a leader in their tribe. It could be a man or a woman. And that's been the case for thousands of years. And so I journeyed into the wilderness of Borneo. Like, Borneo's so wild that the Dutch wouldn't even colonize it. Like, it's something special. It's like original rainforest, 140 million years old of perfect, pristine biodiversity. I've never breathed air like it. There's nothing like it. It's just extraordinary. We traveled 6 hours up a river. no phone signal, no Wi-Fi. My nervous system rejoiced. It was amazing. We went to one village. They'd never seen foreigners before. It was the first time they'd have foreigners in their village. Amazing. And so it was a real immersion into the diet culture. And through the eyes of Desi, who was this very visionary activist. She's 25 years old and she's founded five primary schools, Indigenous primary schools, to empower Dayak youth, because modernization is a risk to their culture. They're seeing a lot of influence from smartphones and whatnot. And so they want to preserve the culture and keep it alive and healthy, because it's one of the few really authentic nature-loving cultures on the planet, and there's so much we can learn. You can go on the trip, by the way. I'd highly recommend checking out the Togetherness project. It's run by David Metcalf, brilliant New Zealander. He's an Indigenous ambassador, really great guy, gifted photographer, and he brought us on this trip. It was really life-changing, actually, just to witness a culture like that, and how Desi works with the young children. So the education system in Indonesia it's quite formal in that the teacher's at the top of the classroom and the students are there, and there's very little interactivity. They don't really ask the students many questions. And so Desi had to, I suppose, bring the students on quite a journey. It takes a lot of time to get the students into a place where they're very interactive and engaging, and they're confident and curious about asking questions and taking initiative and inventing new projects. And so she's gone on this process with the kids, and it's amazing to see. Like you could see the difference in the kids that Desi has been working with, say, for 2 or 3 years, versus the kids she's been working with on 2 or 3 sessions so far. Like, they're just transformed, these children. There's no equivalent. It was really remarkable. And we went on trips through the jungle, and Desi would she would pick breakfast with, and the small children, they'd all been trained, how to spot breakfast. And they would exclaim to me, "This is our supermarket and it's all free." And they'd jump off the boat and they'd run off, and they'd know all the most delicious fruit and vegetables. And we ate like the favorite fruit of the orangutan, which tastes like figs and pears. It's absolutely delicious. Bizarre Freudian slip, that one. It was just a really amazing experience. I'd highly recommend it.
Do you think, is there a moment or an example that kind of sticks out? Because now you have, the reality is we are living in this technological era. So we can either try to work against it or work with it. So in this culture, and I think I've looked into a bit where, they're using it for means of recognizing that this has a power for good, a power for change. What did you witness in terms of that balance, in terms of retaining that balance and that equality and that nature-loving aspect, but also just that reverence for each other and families, but also recognizing that these are, 20-something kids who are going to eventually need to provide for their families, potentially leave this, beautiful Borneo rainforest and operate and continue to share those stories, because there is going to be that tipping point where once they leave that bubble, and the bubble that most of us, would have left and have to leave, how does that information transfer? What do they do to kind of find that balance and continue it?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose Desi's 25, but she's a very old, wise soul. She's very aware of that too. And she's a real balance in how she perceives her original culture, her traditions, and then the potential opportunities within technology and modernization too. So she did that. She left her tribe and she went to study to university in Pontiac, in the local university in the city, and studied English, and went through a big process there, and cultural shock, as she would describe it herself. But she could see the benefits, and she could see that it's an opportunity for her tribe to spread the awareness of her culture. And so, for example, her younger sister, Deli, who is, I think she's 21 years old now, she's studying tourism in Jakarta. And so Deli has got more followers on Instagram and YouTube than Herstory. And she's sharing her culture through music. So she's a really talented sape instrument musician, which is their local indigenous instrument. It's absolutely stunning. It's known for its healing powers. And so she's got all these followers all around the world, and she's spreading the word, thanks to the internet. And she sees it as a really positive. So you can take those tools and use them for good too. And so, like, we were having great conversations when we were there about what other things we could do. So if the kids are on their smartphones all the time, well, maybe we need to create an app then where we gamify their culture so that it's a way, actually a tool to teach them about their culture and gamify it. So if there's any app developers in the room where you have contacts, let's make it happen. So it's how you ultimately harness the tool and use it for good. But I mean, I think there's a lot of positives with technology and what's possible, and like that, because I'd made a connection with Desi. Then we were doing a big light show in Ireland on Bridget's Day this year for the goddess. And the theme was student power, because a young 16-year-old girl in Ireland reached out to me and said, "Oi, let's celebrate student activists." We said, "Brilliant, let's make it happen." She's like the Greta Thunberg of Ireland. She's not your average 16-year-old. She's pretty feisty, brilliant young girl, Saoirse Exton. And we made it happen. And I had an opportunity then to share the story of Desi and her sisters with students all across Ireland, and we briefed the art design students from the National College of Art and Design and Coláiste Dúlaigh, and they got to hear the stories of and they did create new portraits of Desi and her sisters, and they were illuminated, projected on Trinity College and the GPO in Dublin, and Desi got to see that, and our students, and all the students have seen it too. So you never know when you've got a small idea where it'll lead to, or the dots that will ultimately join up, as Steve Jobs says. Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, I'm sure everyone can kind of feel in the room here as well. Is like there is so much passion and hope, and for what you hope to do with the work you do by sharing the stories, capturing them, going to these different tribes, learning from them, recognizing that these ways of being and the ways to interact have already existed for thousands of years. It's about shining a light on it, literally and figuratively, sharing those stories and allowing for other people to look at her story as an example, as maybe a case study for what they can apply in their cultures and in their communities. With all of that hope, though, you are human. There must be moments where you get scared or there's that struggle. Is there a challenge that you're currently navigating internally? Despite the fact that you've kind of carved your path, you are a dreamer who gets to do. But with that, there also comes, I imagine, a lot of responsibility, a sense of moral compass that you have to constantly, check in with. So what challenges do you have? What do you fear?
Yes, at the moment, actually, we've just been funded to create a project about the peace heroines of Northern Ireland. And so that's being created at a time of great sensitivity in Northern Ireland because of Brexit. It's destabilised the peace process. It's was and still is one of the most successful peace processes in modern history. But it's under threat, and very real threat, actually. And so we've got a young generation who've never seen violence in Northern Ireland. They've never seen it before, and they're experiencing it for the first time. And there was a bomb threat on Friday, a peace event, and so it's really sad. It's really heartbreaking. But I think there's an opportunity to galvanise people to recommit to peace and to have courage in the face of that very real threat of violence, and to empower the next generation. I think to really rewrite the future of Northern Ireland together, and that's from both sides. And I suppose the gift for me in that is, it's personal too, but I'm lucky in that. So the division is between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, and it's nothing actually to do with religion. It's cultural in the divide, in the sense that, in colonialism in Ireland, there was no black or white. We all look the same. So the religion was used as a means of division. And so I actually have both sides in my DNA. So the polarity literally dissolves in my DNA. It has dissolved 5 generations ago. So my great-great-grandfather married a Presbyterian, broke the rules, was disinherited, kicked out of his family. They never talked to him again. He did it for love. And that's the beauty of love. Like, it understands, like, no borders, no division, no discrimination. And if only we listen to it more, And so that's a guiding force for me in knowing that I'm a product of both sides. And that I also, because of that, I actually went to a Protestant school, even though I'm Catholic. In the Republic of Ireland, I was a minority Catholic. 98% of the population in the Republic is actually Catholic, but I was a minority in this school. I was never, ever bullied for being a Catholic. But when I got the school bus back into my hometown, our bus was egged because we were the traitor Catholics who went to the Protestant school, and it was scary. It was intimidating. And so I've experienced a bit of that prejudice. And then as a little child, I was 7 years old when our childminder, who we adored, didn't come to work one day, and her father had been murdered by terrorists in Northern Ireland. He was shot dead in his bed, and they came out and said, we got the wrong man. Too late, he's dead, And I remember feeling her trauma and her shock, and just that little girl, the innocence of a child who doesn't understand, could there ever be a reason why any ideology could be worth that much pain? And the 7-year-old in me still doesn't understand, and that's okay. Now, as an adult, I understand both sides, and I understand the ideologies and the history. But the 7-year-old in me goes, and it's not. I don't think it's simplistic or naive. It's ultimately the truth that we're born with, and it's the truth that we return to. Are we here to create more love and peace in the world? It sounds hippie. That's all that matters, guys. Honestly. And that's the part that I'm going to have to try and alchemize and hold that peace and protect my team and the safety of my team too, because it is a real threat. So that's the dance I'm in at the moment.
So I think, what I'm taking from that is that dance to equality, there's going to be some missteps. There's going to be the moments that we feel scared because we're on this path that it feels bigger than us, and it's a purpose that we have. Checking in with ourselves, checking in with what we know to be so fundamentally true, which is love, and that is an emotion that we all feel. Championing, as you said, the men or the women in various communities to sort of support and raise us up, and ultimately just being a witness to our emotions and addressing. And so spending a lot of time just with ourselves and looking at what's around us in terms of how does that trigger us, because ultimately it all comes down to that in terms of then that's your story, and the way that you live your story is how others will live their story and the way we share. I do want to give an opportunity for the audience to have some Q&A, so I would love to at this point open it up for any questions as well.
So the four empowering ways to view life. Can you go through those again?
The 4 expressions of power. Yeah. It's a game changer, isn't it? Power over. I basically take power over you. I dominate over you. Fundamentally a system of inequality. Power 2, I give you power. Power with, we share power together. And then the power within. Which of the 3 do you choose? And the greatest leaders will choose power with and power to most of the time. Sometimes they might actually need to use a bit of domination. Sometimes it can be done in a healthy way. But just track their behavior and how they use it. It's really interesting. And you can teach that to 8-year-olds. Game changer. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, that one definitely hung with me. Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful. Any other questions?
I have a question about Ireland, and coming from the perspective of the divine feminine. You come from the land of Sheila and the hill of Tara, and the call it the Cairn of the Hag. So you come from a history of the goddess rules, the Bridget's Day. How does this happen in Ireland?
It's a great question. I've been to all those sites, by the way. So I have a real affinity with the sacred sites in Ireland. And there's this very spiritual aspect to Herstory that often emerges in the art that we choose. But behind the scenes, my team are all deeply spiritual and very connected to the sacred feminine. And so if you track back, I suppose Ireland is we are the people who always came from somewhere else. So there's no real indigenous Irish original people. There are those who claim that there is, but actually there isn't. And so you've got a series of invasions, whether it's the Normans, the Celts, and you often have this idealization of Celtic culture. John Moriarty, the great philosopher and naturalist, mystic, said that the day the Celts landed in Ireland was the darkest day of Irish history because it brought the beginning of the end of the goddess culture. It all went underground. So we had a goddess worshipping culture. All of Europe did, actually, by the way, in prehistory. That's when I'm referring to the pre-domination era. It was a goddess worshipping culture. The evidence is there. It's in the archaeology. It's in the art. 3 of our founding creation myths are all goddess stories. Ireland is named after a goddess, the goddess Eru. To give you an example of how rejected and neglected she is, I thought in a whim one day, I might just register the business name Eru to see, if it's available. Only one person in the country is allowed to own each business name. That's how it works in Ireland, by law. I bought Eru. Nobody's ever thought to buy the name Eru for a business. I don't know what, I'll have to do something very special with it in honor of the goddess. It's mind-boggling. So we ran a campaign to make Bridget's Day a national holiday in Ireland. It took us 3 years to get it over the line. I didn't it was coming for another 20 years because Patrick is celebrated all around the world. But it's quite interesting. So Bridget was a saint and a goddess, and a pre-Christian goddess. He was celebrated from Spain to Turkey, all across Europe, part of the Celtic culture, and before that. But it's interesting how much the resistance we're already seeing to, there are certain institutions, and I won't name who only want to focus on the saint and just, like, again, delete the goddess culture. So what I did was to rebalance the narrative. We are creating a major animation series about lost goddess cultures from all over the world, starting with Bridget, with a very renowned animation studio. That's the call I was just on before here. And so we're not going to be subtle about it. That goddess culture is going to be emerging, and hopefully it'll inspire more, productions around the world, because there are goddesses cultures. We were studying goddesses in Aboriginal culture, in the Maori culture, in the Maasai culture, in Mayan, First Nations, Native American, you name it. It's amazing. So to answer your question, it's the patriarchy. It all went underground, But it was the Celts. You can't even blame that on the British. That was the Celts who did it. Yeah. Who we idolise in Ireland as great Celtic culture. But actually, the real magic of Irish culture came before the Celts. And they were the Tuatha Dé Danann. It's beautiful mythological sequences, really mystical, magical, very empowering, a lot more equality in those stories. And so we're trying to bring them back to life. So have you heard of the Hill of Ishnock? So there's a Hill of Tara and there's a Hill of Ishnock, and they were known as like the kidneys in ancient Ireland. So they were used to redistribute the power. So that, again, that power with structure. So we didn't have a domination power system amongst the kingdoms in I suppose pre-colonial times. It was all about power sharing, and Ishnock was the feminine, Tara was the masculine. So that's why you've heard of Tara before, never heard of Ishnock. It's actually known globally with indigenous cultures all around the world. It's very significant. Many of the First Nations tribes, the elders, would come and start their world peace tours from this hill. Most people in Ireland have never heard of it before. And so I'm actually travelling back to Ireland, especially to go to the ceremony on the hill. It's a 5,000-year-old ritual where they light the first fire of summer. It's the most primordial experience. The first fire is lit, and then you witness fires in the pitch black for maybe 20 counties all across the country, all illuminate simultaneously. And it's been going for 5. It's such a primordial experience. It's amazing. It's a great excuse to be a pagan and dance around a fire, if you're into that. I'd recommend it. Yeah.
Anyone else?
A long answer.
No, that's great. Any?
Question. I'm curious, like during all your travels, I can imagine you have experienced like so many different rituals. You were speaking a lot about, worshiping nature, and that's something that you find in common in different tribes. Is there any ritual that you have brought into your daily life that you can relate to from any of your trips?
I suppose. Is it a connection to a particular trip? So I'm actually traveling with a very good friend of mine, Morgan G, who is a Taoist teacher, and she's trained with Mantak Chia, the Chinese master. And so she's taught me a lot about the Tao, which is actually fundamentally, it's yin, it's feminine in its essence. And I use those techniques on a daily basis to clear my energy. They're the most effective techniques, especially the 6 healing sounds, the inner smile meditation, and then the qigong. If you want to clear the energy out of your body, there's just too much energy in your field, or it's off kilter, you can retune yourself in 10 minutes. They're super, more effective than any meditation course or yoga I've ever done. I swear by the Tao. And they have amazing goddesses in their culture too. Oh my God, fabulous stories. So you can follow Moira at Feminine Sexual Alchemy. She does a beautiful work with the jade egg practice and sexual alchemy for women. Really powerful. So that I'd swear by that particular practice. I also did a beautiful retreat to the Magdalene area of the south of France, Montségur, led by a dear friend of mine. And we did some very beautiful rituals, ceremonies in the caves where Mary Magdalene and the female disciples would have been 2,000 years ago. And like that, just very powerful energy. When I returned, the only way to integrate it actually was to dance. no sea swimming or meditation would work. I literally had to dance it into my body. So I swear by dance as a ritual. If everything gets too much, or I get, I do, like there's moments like, especially when we saw that bomb scare on Friday, you go, oh my God, what am I doing? And it's live in your nervous system, and then you just dance it into it, back in alignment again and back on soul mission. So I swear by dance. If it's my last tool, if there's nothing else will work, dance will sort me out. And just ecstatic dance as well, and fabulous in Uluwatu.
I mean, I think we could talk for hours and hours on so many talks, but I know we need to wrap up. So I'm going to ask you a final question. I'll give you a moment to think on it while I address the audience. If you had to describe or use 3 words that would describe or be a buzzword for someone as they try to dance towards equality, what those 3 words or terms would be. So I'll let you think about that while I take a moment. I just want to thank everyone for being here in the audience. Having humans sitting here engaging in their energy makes for such a much more powerful and engaging conversation. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today, and for those joining in online. I also want to thank our Tropical Nomad team for giving us a place to be here each and every Monday to share stories in a professional, beautiful, tropical environment, which is such a privilege. And I want to take a moment to thank Robert Ian Bonnick, our founder. So for those of you who are joining for the first time, Robert is the founder of SpeakuP Monday and has been doing this for about 3 years now. We're coming up, this is episode 255. Each and every Monday without fail, and it was started in response to, unfortunately, personal events in his life where people in his network had committed suicide. And for those that may not know, Monday is the highest rate of suicide. So as an answer to that, wanted to create a space for people to come, hear a story, be inspired, feel connected in some way, and maybe question what they're doing and how they're doing it. And he has allowed me to take the host seat, and I am so grateful. So thank you, Robert, for creating this for us. All right. And last but not least, I want to thank Melanie for being the fearless female who is a dreamer and a doer, and is working to really take those nuggets and those stories, and hopefully for future generations to have a curriculum that includes her story, not just his story. So thank you for that. And just the final words.
Discernment, compassion, and dance. I'd literally dance it in.
So discernment, compassion, and dance towards our dance to equality. Amazing. And how can everyone find you and reach you?
I don't have a personal Instagram or anything like that. I kind of stay behind the movement. So if you follow the project, it's Herstory Ireland on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. We haven't got down with the kids and TikTok yet. We've got to do that, right? Seriously, get with the times. And you can sign up for our newsletter as well. The website is herstory.ie. It's a play on history. Herstory. There you go. Ta-da.
Thank you so much for taking this time. She's been on very important calls to help share her story on a global level. So I thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.